Good morning. This is Ron. Welcome to Story Time, and it's December 28th and about 6:10 a.m. and I'm recording this on location at Lovebirds in Pasadena on Colorado Boulevard. And so the story we're reading is called Into the Storm, and so far on the story, there's a hurricane out in the Atlantic that two ships have sailed into, the Minouche and the Faro, and the Minouche has put out a distress signal and is listing and taking on water, and the Coast Guard crew has come out to see about rescuing the crew, and so they're on scene at the where the Minouche is, and beginning the task of rescuing the sailors. Back in Clearwater, Coast Guard Commander Fye and others listened closely as Cournier went into the water, following the action from the Jayhawks' radios with rapt attention. Unresolved in their minds, though, was another 800-foot-long mystery. Where was El Faro? Why hadn't they heard from the big cargo ship in hours? What was going on out there? Unlike with the Minouche, there had been no emergency signal, no way to know where El Faro was, much less how she was doing. The only thing the Coast Guard could do was try to get eyes on the vessel, and they could only do that in daylight. With one rescue already underway, the base commander, Captain Lorenzen, pondered the toughest choice of his career. If he didn't hear from El Faro by morning, he'd have to decide whether to send one of his giant C-130s into the eye of a Category 4 hurricane. He huddled with officers, including the on-duty pilot, Lieutenant Commander Jeff Hustis. Was it possible to hunt the ship in a hurricane? Could they risk it? Hustis was game. "We'll give it a try," he said. Then he was told to get some sleep. Cournier grabbed the most frightened-looking man on the raft and pulled him into the water. He signaled for the basket, a welded stainless steel cross between a seat and a stretcher. When it arrived, Cournier loaded the survivor in and motioned for the hoist. Then he turned to swim back to the raft, only it wasn't there. Winds and current had pulled it 100 yards away. Meanwhile, up in the Jayhawk's cabin, Andrews was unloading the first rescue. The man, barefoot, in cut-off blue jeans and a T-shirt, was cramped with fear. His eyes were as big as hubcaps, and he clung to the basket. Even now, safe inside the chopper, he wouldn't let go. Andrews yelled and began prying off his fingers and pushing him from the steel contraption. After all the commotion, Andrews looked down for his rescue swimmer. At first, he couldn't see him, but then he spotted Cournier chasing after the raft. It took Cournier 5 minutes of hard swimming to catch up to the inflatable. He pulled out another sailor and waved for the basket. After loading the survivor and sending the basket up, Cournier looked over and saw that the raft had again drifted. Watching from the Jayhawk, Andrews didn't think that the Cournier would last if he had to constantly chase the raft. He radioed down for Cournier to hook in, and he hoisted the swimmer up. Andrews and McCarthy consulted. They decided they'd try to hover taxi Cournier where he needed to go, dangling him from the cable just above the waves until he was close to the raft. This worked for the next couple of survivors, but the process was making Cournier impatient. He was thinking about the Jayhawk's fuel and feeling the need to move faster. That's when he pointed at one scared survivor, grabbed his collar, and pulled him from the raft. The man gave a high-pitched scream and jumped into the water on top of him. In a panic clench, the man wrapped his legs around Cournier and pushed down on the rescuer's shoulders. Cournier's training kicked in like a feral instinct. Suck, tuck, and duck. He sucked in a full breath, then tucked his chin down to protect his throat. He wiggled one arm free and tapped the man gently to let him know everything was okay. But the sailor freaked even more, screaming louder and thrashing his arms in the water. So with his free hand, Cournier jammed his thumb into a pressure point underneath the sailor's jawbone, just as he'd been trained. With his trapped arm, Cournier was able to ram his other thumb into a pressure point above the man's left elbow. The sailor froze. Cournier quickly flipped him around, grabbed him in a cross-chest carry, and swam him to the basket. The following couple of survivors went smoothly in the basket and up to the helicopter. But as Cournier loaded the next sailor into the basket and signaled for the hoist, a gust of wind dropped the Jayhawk, and a wave came rearing up. As the copter dipped dangerously low, the soothing robotic voice of a warning sensor cautioned, "Altitude, altitude." Meanwhile, the wave caught the basket with the man inside. and carried away from the copter. It was as if a hooked fish was pulling fishing line from a reel. Andrews desperately played the cable out from the hoist while giving furious directions to the pilot. Back and left 20, back and left 30. Pilots don't like hearing numbers getting bigger. It means something's wrong and getting worse. The basket, yanked from the helicopter, had pulled through the wave and come swinging back like a pendulum. After several harrowing minutes, both for the crew and for the man yo-yoing against the wind and waves in the basket, the steel cage reached the Jayhawk. The sailor inside, bloodied but alive, rolled out onto the cabin floor. Andrews looked down at the heap of bodies now huddled on his floor. In the flash of strobe lights, he could see the chopper filling up. He needed that floor space, so Andrews instructed the sailors to move. No response. He motioned for them to find a place to sit. No response. Gradually, Andrews saw that the men were catatonic with shock. After a minute, as if waking from a nightmare, they slowly began to respond. In order to burn fuel as efficiently as he could, Post had positioned the hovering helicopter so it faced the headwind. Still, with only 8 survivors in the cabin, McCarthy, watching the fuel gauge, signaled that they had to return to base. Andrews hoisted Corny up to the Jayhawk, and the winded swimmer yanked off his mask. He was exhausted and exhilarated, and desperate to get back into the fight. "There's still people there," Corny shouted above the rotor's roar. The implication was that he wanted to stay behind with them, but McCarthy was firm. They'd be back soon. They'll be okay. They're on the raft. With the wind behind them, the trip back to Great Inagua took about 15 minutes. The men were pumped up for a quick turnaround, but as they hit the tarmac, a bird flew up into the rotor blades and pureed itself. The bird strike cost them 40 minutes, as they were required to pore over all the intake ports looking for feathers and bones. A quick but thorough inspection cleared the helicopter. Andrews, meanwhile, played out all of the hoist cable, checking for broken strands. It, too, looked clean. At the time, McCarthy evaluated the most important equipment, his crew. No one slurred his speech, their eyes focused. Everyone looked ready for more. We were in our battle rhythm, McCarthy surmised. It was about 4 a.m. when they flew back to the Minouche. On the scene, Kearney had dropped into the waves again and quickly recovered one sailor. But as Andrews guided the cable lifting the basket into the Jayhawk, he felt a snag on his glove. Sure enough, a few strands had broken. There was no way around it. They would have to return to base and swap helicopters. In keeping with their failing luck, when they radioed their return, there was another problem. The storm had jammed shut the hangar's 60,000-pound cast concrete doors. As the helicopter sped to the base, the ground crew was furiously trying to pry the doors open with the tow tractors. The doors were wrenched open just as the Jayhawk landed. By the time they returned to the Minouche's crew and the new Jayhawk, the storm had grown worse. The jagged stabs of lightning illuminating the void had increased. This, combined with static electricity generated by the helicopter itself, had the potential to charge the metal all around them. Andrews had put a static discharge cable on the basket to siphon off the charges, but the waves had ripped it off. Kearney, now in the water, was recovering the first of the last 3 survivors. As the cable lifted the basket out of the water, he reached up to steady it, and bam! An electric shock convulsed him to his chest, locking both arms. After the charge passed through him, he pried his hands off the steel. There was nothing to do about it, he thought, except be careful. From then on, he had to make sure the basket was in the water and grounded before he touched it. With that last complication addressed, he was able to load the remaining 2 survivors into the basket. Then the cable came down for him. Kearney clipped in for his final hoist up. Post radioed their return, and the Jayhawk turned west to Great Inagua just as dawn began to stain the gray clouds orange. The crew of the Minouche had been saved, but as day broke in Clearwater, one very big problem remained: the mystery of El Faro. At 6 a.m., the C-130 pilot Jeff Hustis woke to the on-base radio announcement. Put the ready C-130 on the line. First light search for motor vessel El Faro in the vicinity of Crooked Island. That was his plane. He was going out in the storm. The plan was to approach the hurricane from the north, then fly in between its bands toward the assumed last position of El Faro. Joaquin was still not adhering to any models. Hurricane winds stretched 50 miles out from the eye, and tropical storm force winds stretched for an additional 205 miles. But the storm had simply stopped moving above the Bahamas' Crooked Island. It was just sitting there, spinning in place. Hustis and his crew lifted off the tarmac at Clearwater and set course for the center of Joaquin. On their approach, the crew could see the stratified layers of clouds and precipitation. Hustis was amazed at how organized the storm was, with pronounced dark bands, then a gap through which they could see sunlight and blue sky, then another dark band. They picked their way inside the storm by flying between these bands until they got to the search box, the area where El Faro was most likely to be. But the storm was hampering the radar, so Hustis flew out of the chaos, descended to 2,000 feet, and then flew back in. As they raced between the clouds, visibility would drop to zero, and sudden gusts would plunge the plane 800 feet at a time, or an updraft would shoot the plane forward 50 miles per hour faster than they had been going. It was the toughest flying Hustis had ever done. The crew, using radar and the naked eye, scoured the surface of the water. They flew for nearly 8 hours, their attention locked on the wild sea below, but they saw nothing but sea and storm. For the next week, the Coast Guard flew more than 250 hours over 180,000 square miles. After several days, a Jayhawk crew noticed some debris and flew down for a closer look. There, drifting in the waves, was an orange survival suit with a body inside. Just as they were about to retrieve it, the Jayhawk was called away to an electronic beacon that might have signaled survivors. A false alarm. When they returned, the body could not be found. Today, El Faro sits nearly 3 miles beneath the surface. The loss of all 33 hands made the sinking the worst American maritime incident in decades. And though the wreck has been located, with her bridge seemingly violently ripped from the vessel, many mysteries remain about the final hours aboard El Faro and the nature of the storm that took her down. Some of those questions will be answered in the coming months by the voice data recorder that investigators recovered from the sea floor this summer. Others will be taken up by the National Transportation Safety Board, which plans to issue a report next year about whether errors in judgment contributed to the disaster. Other questions could be addressed by the courts. Families of 23 crew members have reached settlements with the tote services, El Faro's parent company, but others are still pursuing suits. The guardsmen on Great Inagua that night last fall, when the storm hit, think often about what they learned. In the soggy aftermath of their rescue, after the hugs, some of the Jayhawk crew lingered in the hangar to hear Captain Galera describe the waves that took over his ship, the failing engines, the slipping cargo, the feeling of dread. The survivors of the Minouche were eventually flown to Haiti, and with their ship gone, none have so far returned to Miami, at least according to their shipping agent and the men who worked the docks where the Minouche once tied up. None of the crew could be reached for their story. Their accounts come from official reports and conversations they had with the Coast Guard crew. It would be understandable if they were trying to forget their night spent in a hurricane's grip. As for the Jayhawk crew, what they had to hold on to is something different. To a man, they all recall the eerie light they saw coming from the chopper as they approached the dying ship, that dull glow dimming to dark as the Minouche slowly slipped under. When I saw that ship lit up and the waves washing over it, I went from, this is going to be awesome, to, well, Kernia recalled, his voice trailing off as he remembered how they raced into the storm, how they fought all night, and how, finally, for a dozen fortunate sailors, they managed to keep the darkness from overtaking the light. And that's the conclusion of Into the Storm from the November 2016 issue of GQ, and it was written by Tristan Corton, who's a writer living in Miami, and this is his first story for GQ. So, the next episode, because this is like episode 14 or 15, I'd have to check, and part 3 of this story, and the next episode of Story Time will be on Friday, the 30th. Friday, December 30th. And until then, have a great day and have a great week. Bye.